Welcome everyone to another Art at Noon at PAFA. Thank you so much for joining us and spending your lunch hour with us. I'm Leah Triplett Harrington. I am the Director of Exhibitions and Contemporary Curatorial Initiatives here at the museum, and I'm really delighted to have our speaker here today and to be introducing her. We have with us Zara Anishanslin, to discuss a significant work in the PAFA collection, George Washington at Princeton, in her lecture, Finding Black Founders in Iconic Early American Portraits. So as I mentioned, I'm a contemporary person, but so I'm super excited to learn something about the collection today. Thank you for being here, Zara. We are going to have you talk for about 40 to 45 minutes. And then we will come back for about 15-20 minutes of Q&A, which I will moderate. So please have your questions ready for her. And before we get started, I do want to thank the Barron family for their support of this Art at Noon lecture series. We are very grateful for the support in memory of Rose Susan Hirshhorn Barron, a former docent of the Academy and a great supporter of our education programs. So thank you very much. And thank you, Zara. And I need to actually introduce you. Sorry. So yes, to orient us a little bit, I will give Zara's bio, which is very long and impressive. So I'm going to synthesize a little bit. But Zara Anishanslin is an associate professor of history and art history at the University of Delaware. She works on early America and the Atlantic world with a focus on material culture and public history. She previously taught at CUNY and at Columbia and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Art History at Johns Hopkins. Her first book, Portrait of a Woman in Silk, Hidden Histories of the British Atlantic World, from Yale University Press in 2016, was the inaugural winner of the Library Company of Philadelphia's Biennial Book Prize in 2018 and a finalist for the 2017 Best First Book Prize from the Berkshire Conference of Women's Historians. Her current project, The Painter's Fire, A Forgotten History of the Artists Who Championed the American Revolution. She's been a Mount Vernon Georgian Papers Fellow at the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle, a Davis Center Fellow at Princeton's History Department, and a Mellon ACLS Scholars and Society Fellow with the Museum of the American Revolution, working to innovate doctoral training and build bridges between academia and the public, much needed. She is also the current fellow at the Davis Center for American Revolution at the American Philosophical Society and the creator and co-host of the forthcoming podcast, Things for Things, the history podcast where things matter and stuff happens. And she's also been on the Travel Channel's Mysteries at the Museum show and served as material culture consultant for Lin-Manuel Miranda's show, Hamilton the Exhibition. Super impressive. Thank you so much for being here, Zara. And now I will hand it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Leah. It's such a pleasure to be here. And thank you so much, everyone, for giving of your time and potentially your lunch break as well. I'm honored by your presence. And I hope I manage to entertain you while you enjoy your lunch. PAFA is one of my favorite places, not just in Philadelphia, but in America. And I think it's an architectural and art historical gem of the highest order. And I drag my students there whenever I can. So it's a real delight and honor for me to be speaking to you, centering in not solely, but as a sort of linchpin to the discussion, one of PAFA's truly iconic portraits. And bear with me while I share my screen. There we go, just to confirm that everyone is able to see this okay. All right, excellent. So today I'm going to speak to you about finding Black founders in iconic early American portraits, focusing in on William Lee, as I said, as sort of a connector, but we're going to zoom in and out using him as a linchpin to some other Black founders and other iconic early American artists and portraits, some at PAFA, some not. And along the way, some of this is a sneak peek at my forthcoming book, The Painter's Fire, which will be released by Harvard next summer. Delighted to say it's in production. Yay, that means my heavy lifting is done. So, if you enjoy this, think of it as a sort of teaser, because it does draw on some things that are in the book and some things that I didn't have time to put in the book or space. So this is a great chance for me to be able to devote more time to one of my favorite historical people, William Lee, more than I was able to in the book itself. And William Lee, born in Virginia, although he wasn't an artist himself, he was more familiar than most 18th century Americans with the craft of painting portraits. Contemporaries described him as, quote, muscular and athletic, but his own likeness actually remains a mystery. And this might sound strange to you because for 20 years of their lives, Lee was the enslaved body servant to George Washington. And he was one of the himself, Washington, one of the era's most popular subjects. And I think a lot of us think we know that there's a portrait of William Lee, but I'm going to complicate that supposed story a little bit today. During the American Revolution, William Lee spent more time with the commander in chief than his own wife, Martha, did. Lee was at Washington's side throughout the war, tending to his personal needs, polishing his boots, caring for his uniforms and other clothes, tying back his reddish hair, and sometimes powdering it white. He also served the many visitors Washington entertained, cared for and safeguarded his papers, and coexisted alongside him in one of the small antechambers and other rooms of Washington's famous tent, which you see here as it looks on display at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. After the war, Lee continued as Washington's valet until crippling injuries to his knees on two separate occasions forced him, very reluctantly, to relinquish that role during Washington's first presidential term. So, as much as Washington himself or the artists who painted him, William Lee, who cared for Washington's clothing and personal hygiene needs, was responsible for how Washington looked in many of his portraits. And by 1785, Washington had sat for so many portraits that he joked, quote, in for a penny, in for a pound. I'm hackneyed to the touches of the painter's pen, so that I'm now altogether at their beck and sit like patience on a monument whilst they are delineating the lines of my face. I will say Washington had many fine qualities, and his ability to make a joke was probably not one of them, but this was his attempt at it. Um, Ironically, neither man, Washington nor Lee, was physically present for the only portrait commonly presented today as being of the two of them. John Trumbull's famous 1780 portrait, George Washington and William Lee, at the Met Museum, which you see here right now. By including Lee in his portrait of Washington, Trumbull acknowledged that Lee was a well-known figure to British and American soldiers, not only serving as Washington's valet, but often riding by his side, always visible with him during the war. And in this double portrait, Trumbull memorialized both men's wartime identities. Washington stands in a pose of command, wearing his buff and blue Continental Army regimental uniform, pointing toward the military fortress of West Point, high above the Hudson River. Beside him, the black man on horseback, wearing a blue coat with red collar and cuffs and a red turban, is identified as Lee. Trumbull's double portrait was made into a print by a London engraver and available for sale in 1781, and then later copied by French as well as British engravers in various forms. So this print, made after the portrait, really enhanced Washington's already heroic image and made his enslaved companion Lee an integral part of his visual identity in Europe. But neither man, as I mentioned, actually sat for the portrait. Trumbull painted it in London from memory of Washington, completing it before his arrest and imprisonment for 8 months on a charge of treason. Now, though Trumbull vehemently denied being a spy, he was sympathetic to the American cause. And he had the misfortune to be in London at a time when the British government looked with increasing suspicion upon Americans in their midst, and a number of high profile arrests were made. Notable among these was that of Henry Lawrence, who you see here, a former president of the Continental Congress and newly appointed US ambassador to the Netherlands. Now, while en route to Europe in 1780, Lawrence's ship had been taken on the high seas by the British, who brought Lawrence to London as soon as they figured out who he was. He was charged under Britain's Treason Act for treason both in Philadelphia and for piracy on the high seas. Since he had the misfortune to be in a boat, he wasn't actually a pirate. That would have been really interesting. Lawrence was an important enough prisoner that he was sent to the Tower of London, which you see in the background of his portrait there. Welcomed into prison mockingly to the tune of Yankee Doodle, which he himself quipped, quote, rather made me cheerful instead of making him feel disdained as the British intended. But his honorable imprisonment in the Tower of London, where kings and queens had been before him, came at a high cost. Lawrence's health suffered, as did his finances, as he had to pay for his living expenses, and honestly, he was physically never the same again. Now, when Trumbull was arrested on charges of treason the month after Lawrence was sent to the Tower, he too was deemed important enough to be sent there. But he declined the honor, saying it was too costly for him. Trumbull was important enough because he was the son of the Patriot governor of Connecticut and a former colonel in the Continental Army. And in the early days of the war in Boston, he'd served as one of Washington's aide-de-camp. Eventually, though, he permanently resigned his commission to pursue an art career, and he arrived in London in 1780 and began to study with Benjamin West, who you see there working with his so-called American school in a painting done in the 1760s by another American gone to London to paint, Matthew Pratt. So he was one of the American patriots in London who were carefully watched by American loyalists as well as British government officials. And Trumbull was particularly singled out as being, and I quote, a dangerous person in the service of Dr. Benjamin Franklin. West was very nervous about the fact that his protege Trumbull had been arrested. West, as you all know, was the king's painter, and this could have damaged his reputation with His Royal Highness. And via Sir Joshua Reynolds, West managed to get in an appeal to the King's Privy Council for help. So Trumbull was set free on bail and told he would be free from further prosecution if he left England immediately, which he promptly did. And I think everyone here knows that Trumbull eventually went back to London and then went on to have a very successful career painting a great many more pro-American paintings. But in the meantime, let's go back to Trumbull and sit a little bit with this famous portrait, which is often used to depict Washington and Lee. Now, Trumbull, as I mentioned, served in the Continental Army, and he was one of Washington's aide-de-camp. As a member of Washington's inner military circle, Trumbull would have seen William Lee pretty much daily. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that Trumbull's portrait, which I've zoomed in on here, conveyed one of Lee's defining qualities and skills when it showed him mounted on and in command of a horse. Lee, like Washington, was known for being a fearless rider whose equestrian skills astonished his contemporaries. Before the war, he often rode out by Washington's side on Washington's many fox hunts. And during the war, his legendary riding talent was one of the reasons that later visitors to Mount Vernon after the war sought him out. Veterans and international visitors would frequently seek out Lee. Interestingly, sometimes in tandem with trying to see Washington's chestnut battle horse, Nelson, because they were eager to meet the celebrated horseman. And as a family member remembered, all of them bestowed a token of remembrance upon the old body servant of the Revolution. Lee, in other words, during and after the war, became a really integral part of Washington's wartime mythology, not just in portraits like this, but in the collective memory of particularly men who served in the Army. But Trumbull's portrait, while it acknowledges this intertwined history in an important way, does not create an accurate likeness of William Lee. Instead, the artist chose to paint Washington's valet in the form of an orientalized style, a familiar stock figure used repeatedly in 18th century art to symbolize Blackness. And here's but one example. Now, this image of a person with very dark skin, exaggerated facial features, and wearing accessories that exoticized him, such as a silver collar, a pearl necklace or earring, which you see on the figure from Hogarth's Taste and High Life on the right, or a turban, as in the case of both the Trumbull painting and the Hogarth rendition. And the Hogarth rendition, of course, is from the 1740s. So just with these two portraits, we see how this image, this exoticized, deliberately orientalized, stereotyped version of African figures persisted in British and American art for decades at a time. So rather than an accurate likeness, the Trumbull portrait represents Lee as a racialized stereotype, one commonly used by artists like Hogarth, but one that shows Black people defined by their enslavement or their service to white people, one that very much others them. Trumbull's portrait, then, is a stereotyped rather than a lifelike representation of William Lee. But there is, I argue, another painting that very likely does, in fact, show us the real William Lee, and that brings us to a Philadelphia favorite, Charles Willson Peale. So let's look at a portrait painted around the same time as Trumbull's by another Revolutionary War soldier, Charles Willson Peale, who, like Trumbull, knew both Washington and Lee. In 1779, the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania commissioned Peale to render a grand, and this thing is huge, painting of Washington to hang in the council chamber in Philadelphia's Independence Hall. The 9-foot-tall painting officially memorialized, and I quote, how much the liberty, safety, and happiness of America was owed to His Excellency General Washington. Multiple copies were made of this painting and sent abroad as well as within the United States, and they exist in many collections today. And this painting was meant to be widely seen. and to solidify Washington's image as commander-in-chief. And in Peale's portrait, Washington wears his buff and blue Continental Army regimentals, as he did in Trumbull's, and in this case, the blue silk sash that marked his rank as general slung across his chest. Peale included in the background a man in profile holding the reins of a horse, a chestnut horse like the famous Nelson. The man wears a dark blue coat with red facings and has skin closer to the brown of the horse than the pale skin of Washington. Washington sat for this portrait when he and Peale were both in Philadelphia in 1779. And I'm going to zoom into this one too and show you, oops, apologies, that Peale took pains to render this realistically. He was doing this from life as opposed to Trumbull, and you can see he depicts the Battle of Princeton in the background, a battle in which he too fought. And although the man in the background is not identified, given Peale's desire to accurately depict both Washington and the battle site, and at least a passing likeness of the chest, there's good reason to think that that man is in fact William Lee. Now, Lee was certainly known to Peale. Like Trumbull, Peale served under Washington. Indeed, both artists showed the man in charge of the horse wearing the same coat with the same colors, and both distinguished the color of his skin as darker than that of Washington. But unlike Trumbull, Peale had the chance to paint William Lee from life. In 1779, Lee was with Washington in Philadelphia, and he may have been particularly delighted to have his own portrait put on public display in the city, as that was the year he married a free Black woman from Philadelphia, Margaret Thomas, who worked as a seamstress and washerwoman in Washington's headquarters from 1776 to 1779. Now, there's another reason to think that Peale's portrait is of Lee, and that is that Lee was a man of mixed race. Washington purchased William Lee, who was born around 1750 or 52, in 1767 from Mary Smith Ball Lee, who was the wealthy, recently widowed wife of John Lee. William and his brother Frank, who served as the Washington's butler, kept the surname of Lee despite the purchase. And this is by no means necessarily the case in all instances of enslaved people being transferred. I have zero confirmation for this next theory, but I'm going to share it anyway. I suspect that the Lees, William and Frank, might have been the children of their former enslaver, John Lee. And the reason I think this is that he and Mary had no children of their own. Her pointed sale after her husband's death might reflect her discomfort with her husband's enslaved offspring. And as I mentioned, both men were adamant about keeping the surname of Lee. And it's interesting because Washington alternated throughout Lee's life how he referred to him, calling him alternately Billy, Will, and then eventually William. And Lee himself, I think it's important to note, didn't like the diminutives. He preferred the more dignified name of William. But despite the changeable reference of his first name, Washington never changed his description of Lee as what he called, quote, mulatto, a term used in 18th century America to indicate that a person was of mixed race, usually with one white parent and one Black parent, although that could be graduated. At the time, such precise terms were meant as much to maintain a racist distinction between whites and others as to categorize someone's parentage. And they were part of the system that propped up the race-based chattel slavery that was found in all 13 of the American colonies that banded together in 1776 to declare their liberty from Britain. Now, since American law dictated that enslavement was inherited or not according to the status of a baby's mother, all enslaved mulatto people had a Black or mixed race enslaved mother and a white father. At Mount Vernon, as at many other Virginia plantations, people of mixed race tended to labor as domestics. And here I'll go back to this and show you the man in the corner here who is wearing a specially designed livery that the Washingtons used for people who labored as domestics, as valets like Lee, or butlers like his brother Frank, or maidservants like Martha Washington's now famous dower slave, Ona Judge. In short, William Lee, for a variety of reasons, probably looked more like the brownish man in Peale's portrait than the stereotyped, overly exaggerated racist stock figure used by Trumbull. And in contrast to the brown skin of the man holding the horse in the original version of the painting here, if you compare it with a later rendition, for example, the one on the right at Princeton Art Museum, which is added in different figures, you'll notice that all of these men, these three men, have skin that's so pale, it's really almost luminous. In other words, Peale has gone to great pains to differentiate between the skin color of the people in these various portraits. Appearance then lines up, but why would Peale include Lee? Peale remembered Lee after the war ended. In 1804, Peale visited Mount Vernon, and like many other veterans who made that pilgrimage, made a point to visit Lee. And he spent enough time to note of Lee that because of his two knee injuries, his physique had changed, and he was, quote, now a cripple, and in an extraordinary manner, both of his knee pans were moved from their places and some inches higher up. Now, this is a sad state of affairs for Lee, and evidence that Peale was really interested in what Lee looked like as well. Um, and Lee was of interest to Peale and others because he was not just iconic as Washington's constant companion, but he was one of thousands of Black men who helped to win the war. But the presence of these men was by no means guaranteed, and in part because Washington feared the people he and other patriots or rebels, depending on your point of view, enslaved might run away to the British forces who were promising them freedom. Washington initially could not countenance the idea of even a relatively small number of Black men serving in the American military. So initially, to Washington at least, Lee would have seemed like a bit of an outlier. When Washington arrived in Massachusetts to take command of the army in the spring of 1775, in fact, he found the presence of Black soldiers in New England regiments to be very jarring. And although Massachusetts mandated that only free Black men should be allowed to enlist, on the ground, practice was considerably different. Enslaved as well as free Black men fought at the Battle of Lexington and Concord and then at Bunker Hill. As you see dramatized in John Trumbull's later painting, you'll notice there is a Black man down at the right who is alternately identified as a Patriot soldier named Peter Salem or the enslaved manservant of the man in front of him. But whatever his identity Trumbull intended, Trumbull makes a point to include a Black man in this conflict, and that is reflective of the fact that there were Black soldiers at the Battle of Bunkers Hill. So initially, although Washington tried to exclude Black men from the military, eventually he came around. And in doing this, he exhibited what I think is one of his finer qualities as a leader, which was his ability to change his mind. And at the end of the year of 1775, he issued a general order mandating that Black men were formally allowed to serve in the Continental Army. And this is an interesting point because although the Rhode Island First was a regiment famous for being made up of all Black soldiers commanded by white men, and you see at the far left there an example of a soldier from the First Rhode Island wearing their distinctive all-white uniforms. Most regiments did not separate Black enlisted men into separate units, which meant that the first American military forces were integrated ones, which would not happen again until the 20th century. So in some ways, even though he was resistant at first, eventually Washington had a pretty comparatively egalitarian military situation going on with Black men. And William Lee, had a highly visible role within this integrated military. During the Battle of Monmouth, for example, in 1778, he led a corps of valets on horseback to look over the battlefield. And it was remembered later by a Washington Custis relative that, quote, here Billy halted, and having unslung the large telescope that he always carried in a lantern case, with a martial air applied it to his eye and reconnoitered the enemy. And a military surgeon later remembered that General Washington reviewed his brigade, quote, followed by his mulatto servant Bill. In other words, William Lee was a highly visible presence in the thick of things that men later remembered seeing. And although he was visible and known to most onlookers, far more so than this, for example, now anonymous soldier from the 1st Rhode Island Regiment you see here, he was but one of thousands of these Black Patriot soldiers. And among these Black men was a man who was not just the subject of paintings, but a painter himself. And this is Prince Dima, for a time known as Prince Dima Barnes, after the name of his enslavers, Christian and Henry Barnes. And Prince Dima, who you see here, he's the artist of this portrait of William Duguid, who you see here hanging in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Prince Dima was the first identifiable enslaved portrait painter in America. Dima had an unusual past beyond this. Born in Boston and went on to paint identifiable and surviving paintings, including this one, which is signed on the back, which is remarkable for the time. He'd studied in London under an award-winning British painter, which is also incredibly unusual for an enslaved man at the time. And the man he studied with was Robert Edge Pine, who was an award-winning British artist whose portrait of famed British historian and pro-American thinker Catherine Sawbridge Macaulay, you see here. Robert Edge Pine is a really tantalizing figure because he's someone who died before he could achieve what he hoped to do, artistically speaking. And I like to talk about Robert Edge Pine because he's a great example that there is a lot of iconic early American art that either wasn't created as it was intended to be or was destroyed by the ravages of time. Much of Robert Edge Pine's work, for example, went up in a fire in the 19th century. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about him because these artists were important in their own time. And just because their work doesn't necessarily survive in museums doesn't mean that we shouldn't remember that during their lifetime, some of them were in fact more important to their contemporaries than others who are more famous to us today. And Pine is someone who I like to think would have included a portrait of William Lee in one of his many pictures of the revolution that he intended to paint. Pine immigrated to America after the war because he was from England, but he wanted to immortalize and paint the scenes of the late revolution, as he put it. He wanted to paint from life the principal figures, as he called them, of the revolution. And it seems pretty unlikely given the high visibility of Lee in the prints of Washington and Lee that circled after Trumbull's portrait, as well as the fact that so many men remembered Lee, the historical figure, including people that Robert Edge Pine knew himself. It seems highly unlikely that he wouldn't have wanted to paint William Lee had he had the chance. And I think such a decision would have been personal as well as artistic for Robert Edge Pine, because Pine himself was also likely a man of mixed race. Pine was the son of John Pine, who you see here in a portrait by Hogarth, who was one of his good friends. John Pine was a highly skilled London engraver. He was principal engraver to London's Grand Lodge of Freemasons, of which he was a member, and he held royal appointments to King George III. He also was friends with William Hogarth, who did this portrait of him near the time of his death, which was later copied for years and years into widely circulated prints like this one. And in his features, his hair, and his clothing, John Pine looks like a man of mixed race, a heritage that Hogarth made a point to acknowledge with that telltale pearl earring and turban, which was a marker of blackness, like the turban that Trumbull used in his portrait of Lee. Now, the Pines never publicly acknowledged their mixed race, but other clues support the theory. Observers remembered the diminutive Pine family, apparently they were all very short, using a racialized slur, calling them, quote, a family of pygmies. Another compelling clue was that while still living in London, Robert Edge Pine trained Prince Dima. And if you look at this scene, this is a scene of St. Martin's Court on the famous St. Martin's Lane, which was a hotbed of artistic activities in the 18th century in London. And here you see what might actually be Robert Edge Pine's home with an artist at work in the window. So Dima went to London in the 1770s to get training he could not get in Boston. John Singleton Copley outright refused to teach him, but Pine took him on, which was very unusual. Pine said he was impressed by his genius, but also he was perhaps more willing to work with a Black man than, for example, Copley, because of his own mixed race heritage. And what's interesting is when Pine comes to America, and this is going to sound strange to many of us today, of all the artists who painted Washington's picture, for example, no one had ever come as effusively recommended or by so many important men as Robert Edge Pine. And although he's now all but forgotten, in 1785, when he came to America, he was viewed, and I quote, as the most eminent artist in his way we have ever had in this country. And I think if you surveyed most Americans today and said, who was the most eminent artist in Revolutionary era America, pretty much no one would say Robert Edge Pine. But at the time, this is what people thought of him. So Robert Edge Pine came to the attention of George Washington because one of his dear friends and former neighbor in Virginia, George William Fairfax, first recommended Pine to Washington. Now, Pine was Fairfax's neighbor in the city of Bath in England, and the two were both in these pro-American circles. And Fairfax became friendly with Pine and heard his sob story that his pro-American stance had lost him business and made him so many enemies in Britain that he needed to leave the country to make a living. And Fairfax waxed poetic about how Pine was a, quote, true a son of liberty as any man could be. Fairfax, to support him, bought and sent Washington a copy of Pine's allegorical print America, which you see on the left. Pine made this print in 1778. It was seen as, it looks allegorical and peaceful to us. It was seen as incendiary and very pro-American, anti-British at the time. Pine claimed it lost him a lot of commissions. And you see on the right that George William Fairfax was one of the people who signed up to help finance the production of this print. And in fact, he signed up and bought 5 copies of it. I would love to know who he gave the other 4 copies to, but one he sent to George and Martha Washington, and it is hanging, I hope you can see, in the dining room, the green dining room of the family home in Mount Vernon. And it is the print right here, which is the closest adjacent to the fireplace. So although Fairfax remained in England throughout the war, as you might guess from his support of Pine's incendiary engraving, he shared some of Pine's politics. He supported what he called, quote, the glorious cause of liberty. And after the war, when he felt it safe to express his true feelings, he wrote, I glory in being called an American, which is interesting because at the time he was trying to wrangle an inheritance to part of an English family, noble family. Now, during the war, when Pine and Fairfax both lived in Bath, they discussed their shared admiration for Washington. And they had something else in common, though, too, besides their love of America and Washington and their support of art that showed both those things. Like Pine, Fairfax had a parent believed to be of African descent and suffered rumors about this accordingly. Although related to a noble British family, Fairfax was born in the Bahamas, where his father was a member of the Governor's Council. His mother was born on the island, daughter of a British army officer, and it was persistently rumored, although again, never proven, a mixed race or Black mother. And when the elder Fairfax, George William Fairfax's father, sent his son to school in England, he wrote about how he was concerned for his son, a quote, poor West India boy who has the marks on his visage that will always testify his parentage. In other words, there was fear that he looked like a mixed race boy with a parent of African descent. So whether or not this is true, it's really interesting to me that here are 2 men who both have persistent rumors of family heritage, of shared African descent. And whether or not this is true, they did share politics, and it must have pleased Robert H. Pine to no end that Fairfax not only helped finance his print, but sent one to George Washington. And one of the first things Pine did when he emigrated to America at the end of the war was paint George Washington. And again, I think this is not the typical George Washington that most of us think of. This is a decidedly less heroic version of the general than some we often see. But I think that this is a sort of hallmark of Robert H. Pine's paintings in America, is that he's trying really hard to show things realistically about the people and places of the revolution. And this doesn't always make for the best visually pleasing aesthetic. I'll show you a compare and contrast at the end of the talk of Trumbull versus Pine, and you'll see that Trumbull's definitely much more aesthetically appealing, but Trumbull is in many ways, or Pine rather, is in many ways more historically accurate. And again, it's really interesting to think of what our concept of iconic early American art of the Revolutionary period would look like had Robert H. Pine's paintings survived and not been lost to fire and not completed because of his own death. So you can see here that he portrays Washington as a military commander, but he also has this nice little humanistic touch, showing him sort of leaning on a cane. So again, not quite the war hero. This is the man visibly aged by the revolution at the end of the war. And so when Pine relocated to America, he settled with his family in Philadelphia, which included, and I'd love to talk about this at the Q&A if people are interested, a number of his daughters who actually helped him with all of his paintings and used a really interesting example. So although I'm focusing on Black men, Black founders in this talk, there's also a lot of women artists hidden within these portraits as well. When Pine relocated and settled with his family of his wife, by the way, was also a portrait painter of artistic females in Philadelphia, he also ended up establishing an art museum. Now, Charles Willson Peale, of course, had already established his his smallish museum at this time with portraits of, American notables and beginning to get a little bit into natural history. What was interesting about Pine's Art Museum, by contrast, was that it featured works of art that just weren't available to Charles Willson Peale, and were much less American-centric than Peale's more homespun endeavor. It featured, for example, large paintings of scenes from English history, portraits of actors and roles from Shakespeare's plays, and rather scandalously, a copy of the Venus de Milo, which likely was the first nude statue displayed in the United States, and raised some eyebrows at the time. Now, don't take my word for it. Charles Willson Peale's son, Rembrandt Peale, recalled his wonder at visiting Pine's exhibitions after being used to what he called, quote, his father's small gallery of paintings. By contrast, Rembrandt Peale remembered, when I entered Mr. Pine's spacious salon, I was astonished at its magnitude and the richness of the paintings which covered its walls. And I will say, I don't think the Peels were huge fans of the Pines. So, Rembrandt Peale making this acknowledgement, I think speaks to the relative grandeur of this this art museum that Pine put together. And where he put it actually is interesting because for a time it was rent-free, living at the top of the State House when Congress was not in session, which became Independence Hall as we know it today, before he occupied a sort of bespoke space that Robert Morris helped him to get in a very large house. And Pine planned not just to paint Washington, but anybody who was everyone in the American Revolution, as he called it, the patriots, legislators, heroes, and beauties of the Revolution. And I personally am particularly sad that he didn't get to paint the beauties of the American Revolution because I'm dying to know who he would have included in that number. Um, the only thing that he came close to completing of his proposed grand historical paintings of the American Revolutionary era was the one you see on the left, Congress Voting Independence. And here you see a version that Edward Savage, who in a twisted turn of events ended up having a lot of Pine's paintings before they were destroyed, um, Savage finished, and then it was made into a print, which you see here. And if you compare it with Trumbull's much more famous version on the right, it's the version that's on the back of our currency, for example, you'll notice that there's a couple interesting differences. Pine's is much less romanticized. It's much more realistic. People are portrayed sort of warts and all, in a sense. The architecture of the interior is much more accurate. So I find it really intriguing to think, today we think of the American Revolution via Trumbull, via Copley, et cetera. What would it look like if it were via Pine? Maybe less beautiful and heroic, but perhaps more like photographic evidence than painterly. So one of the first things Pine did, though, to embark on this grand adventure, which sadly he did not finish, was to go to Mount Vernon, because that is where you go if you want to make your mark as a recent immigrant to America. And as I said, he came highly recommended by George William Fairfax, among others. Um, and I think, again, he would have been just as interested in seeing the famous William Lee as George Washington. Um, Washington described him as, quote, a pretty eminent portrait and historian painter. And so Washington himself is somewhat impressed by his reputation that preceded him. So it's unclear whether Pine and William Lee had a chance to meet when he went to Mount Vernon. He was there for 3 weeks, but 6 days before Pine arrived, Lee suffered the first of his crushing knee injuries while away from home. But certainly Pine and Lee crossed paths, if not then a few years later when Lee was with Washington in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention, and Washington again sat for Pine so that he could make some updating elements to copies of this portrait. But on Pine's first encounter with Washington at Mount Vernon, I think it's important to note that he spent far more time with Martha Washington than with George, because Washington left Mount Vernon for Richmond the day after Pine's arrival. And it was Martha Washington, herself an exacting connoisseur of art, who commissioned Pine to paint portraits of her cherished grandchildren and niece. And here you see her niece, Fanny Bassett Washington, in not one of Pine's most realistic portraits. I don't think Fanny actually had quite that long a neck, but that's one of Pine's hallmarks. And this portrait hung, you can see it here, in one of the most socially important rooms of Mount Vernon, the front parlor, not coincidentally furnished with furniture that had once been in George William Fairfax's Virginia home. So she also took the portraits of her grandchildren that Pine painted and hung them in the bedroom she shared with her husband. And this, of course, is the space in which George Washington famously died in 1799. The four portraits of the grandchildren painted by Robert Edge Pine staring down at him from the wall. Now, a group of people attended him at his death, including Martha, his physician, his secretary, and several enslaved people, but William Lee was not among them. But Lee was definitely in Washington's thoughts. As he lay dying, Washington asked his wife to bring him copies of two wills he'd prepared. And after looking them over, he asked her to burn one and keep the other. And in it, he made an unusual provision. He ordered that the people he held enslaved be freed when his wife died. Many historians think he was absolutely influenced by the heroism of Black men fighting during the Revolution. But he freed only one person outright, and that was William Lee, who was granted immediate freedom in testimony of what Washington called my sense of his attachment to me and for his faithful services during the Revolutionary War. As for William Lee, he survived years after Washington died, living on at Mount Vernon, and increasingly, sadly, turning to alcohol, probably to soothe his knee pain, and perhaps also, although they wouldn't have discussed it this way at the time, we would today, the trauma of all the wartime violence he'd undoubtedly observed during his faithful services during the Revolutionary War. Lee died sometime between 1810 and 1828, there are differing accounts, and was buried in Mount Vernon's enslaved people cemetery, probably near Washington's tomb. And although in the 19th century it was claimed that it was remembered where in the ground he was, there's no marker on his grave. So what I'd like to suggest is that it's time we think about marking William Lee's contributions, that instead of an image as William Lee as the racialized stereotype in Trumbull's portrait, let's honor William Lee, the Black founder, and whether or not we'll ever be able to say with certainty that he is in fact the man in PAFA's portrait of Washington at Princeton in the background there holding the horse. I think it's important we at least entertain the thought, because in doing so, we think about Black people as real people rather than racialized stereotype. We think about William Lee and his contribution and what other Black people's histories are hidden, whether they're those of Robert Edge Pine or others like George William Fairfax, who certainly passed for white, but had these persistent rumors following him. To think about how Black founders and their presence in paintings as painters and subjects and patrons is a way to celebrate the important contributions that Black people made to the creation of the United States and its iconic art. Thank you, and I'm so looking forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Zara. That was excellent and right on time. So if you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the screen. Or you can raise your hand using the raise your hand function, or you can put your question in the chat and I will read it out loud. So while we're waiting for people to gather questions, I would love for you to talk a little bit more about the women that you discussed in relation to Pine. That seems like a whole other lecture. But to
Yes,
talk briefly would be great. Yeah.
And so Pine was married to a woman who, again, we have no surviving portraits that are definitely attributed to her. But she is described by him and a few others as a painter of portraits. And after Robert Edge Pine dies in Philadelphia in 1788, she stays for a while, and she and her daughters operate a school for young ladies in Philadelphia, which had as its pupils Thomas Jefferson's younger daughter, one of Martha Washington's grandchildren, and one of Benjamin Franklin's granddaughters, who reported back to her mother, Sally Franklin Bache, that she was excited to go to the school because Mrs. Pine had them sit in order of importance and,
Mm.
in order of rank. And that since she and the Washington and the Jefferson girls were seen as the most important, they got to sit at the head of the table. And Ben Franklin's daughter apparently wrote to Mrs. Pine and said, "I'm so sorry, but in America, the only rank we have is rank mutton, and please do not single my daughter out in that way." So interesting. But nevertheless, one of the reasons that she had this young ladies school was that she and her daughters taught drawing and painting and things that young ladies wanted to be taught.
Mhm.
Her daughters also, what they did, and they don't seem to have started doing this in England until intriguingly his last portrait that he made there, one of his last portraits, which was of an American. And he would paint the heads of people from life, just, so sort of just the head on a piece of canvas. It would be cut out, put onto another canvas, stitched or glued together, and then his daughters would paint around it. And again,
Mm.
very helpful Rembrandt Peale leaves us a very detailed description of this. Um, and there are some surviving paintings that show, because they've been conserved badly, where the head is coming away from the background and you can really see how they're pieced together. And we don't
Mm.
know any other artist who did this in America at this time, which is really interesting. But what's intriguing to me is that, when he was in America, he cranked out, dozens and dozens of paintings, like over 90 portraits that we know of. And I think the reason he was able to do this is because he had his daughters. It was
Mhm.
like a painting factory, and the women were doing this. And two of his daughters did go on to, they all ended up, the ladies, moving back to England in the 1790s, and two of his daughters exhibited at the Royal Academy of London. So they must have been pretty good.
Hmm.
But I think it's a really great example of how, much like Black artists or Black figures, that we have women artists who are, their presence is everywhere in this art, but we don't often acknowledge it.
Mhm. And then there was another question similar to mine. I mean, where can people find out more about this if they're interested?
Well, in my forthcoming book, a lot of this is in there. This
Mhm.
is all, as I said, a sort of a teaser.
Mhm.
References to all of this is in the book. As I mentioned, I'm fascinated by William Lee, and I didn't have the space, narratively speaking, to do as much with him as I did here. And so, this is all contained in there. And there's also there's been very little work done on Robert Edge Pine,
Mhm.
but there is a wonderful catalog of his work with some wonderful essays from the 1980s, I believe, that was at the National Gallery of Art, the Smithsonian, if people want to
Okay,
look into
cool.
that
Cool.
until my book is out.
Yeah, we'll just have to wait. Okay, so I got messages from a couple of you that the Q&A was turned off, so I'm sorry about that. It should be back on now, so you can use that or you can use the chat. Lots of people are thanking you for helping them see things in a different way.
Thank you.
And then we do have one question. Was Wilson Peele's wife of African descent?
I do not know as much about the Peel family as I probably should. So there might be someone in the audience who's able to answer this question better than I am. I think what's really interesting is that, we've known for a long time. I mean, people at the time knew that there were mixed race people, and they're not coming out of nowhere, right? They're coming out of relationships.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
yet, for years and years, Americans would push down stories of, for example, Sally Hemings and her children being
Mhm.
probably the most famous. And so I think personally that, we know that a lot of people of mixed race a significant amount chose to pass as white, right? And
Mhm.
so if you're trying to pass, you're not going to talk about your African heritage. And so I think that people like the Pines are examples of this. It does them absolutely no good to highlight this. But I think when you start digging and you look more deeply into this, you realize that, again, there are people of mixed race everywhere then as there are now. And that, whether or not Charles Willson Peale's one of his wives was one of these people is, I think, something that something that you could put into this larger context of,
Mhm.
why not entertain the possibility? And again, this is the type of thing that's always going to be really hard to prove because, not everyone is going to have the wherewithal to run a comparative DNA test like Monticello, right?
Mhm.
But I think it's a great question. If someone else is a Peale expert, which I definitely am not, other than this one painting, which I've obsessed over, I would love to hear their thoughts.
Um, Let's see. Okay. I don't know if we have Peel experts, but the chat is getting a little lively. Okay, so the next question we had was, how did Prince Dima as an enslaved man get to London?
Hmm. So Prince Dima was, interestingly enough, accompanied by his enslaver, Henry Barnes.
Mm,
Henry Barnes's wife, Christian, was, I think, a woman who she didn't have children. She had a niece she raised as her own, but I think she was a woman who felt frustrated by her life. She said often that if she hadn't been a woman, she could have done other things. And so she was really the one who took Prince Dima in hand and saw his talent. And I think with a great deal of encouragement by Dima and his mother, themselves, obviously. But so she thought that he could become a professional painter. And Copley was sort of like, no way, in
hmm
Boston, which is where they were
hmm
living in the
hmm
area. And so she had the idea that she wanted to send him to London. And he'd been a mariner. He worked on the seas for years before. And so, again, credit should be given to him. He worked his way across the Atlantic. So
mm,
it was a very small gamble on the part of the Barneses, because he worked his way as a seaman across the Atlantic, and then studied with Robert Edgepine. So yes, it is highly unusual. It is very, so I think it's this great synergy of his enslavers being open to it and he and his mother pushing for it, and it actually happens.
mm,
There's a whole lot more about this in my forthcoming book,
hmm
and I think Prince Dima is one of the most fascinating characters in this time period.
mm. Okay, so there was another question about the possible name of the book and the author's last name. So I'm not sure if that's your book that's forthcoming this summer, you said?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
It's called The Painter's Fire.
The Painter's Fire. Okay, great. And then the other book that you mentioned was the catalog from the 80s on Pine, correct? Is that
Yes. And well, actually, it might be in my bookcase. Hold on.
okay? Um,
Yes, it is. All right, here we go.
Great.
1979, sorry.
Oh, almost.
So it is Robert Stewart, and here it is. I don't know if you can see it. It's called Robert Edgepine, British Portrait Painter in America.
Okay, great. And it was at the Portrait
And
Gallery.
it does have a what at the time they knew of his catalog raisonné. So it gives a guide to all of his portraits and gives
Thank
a
you.
lot of good information. Yes.
And then this is a bigger question that I'm going to skip to and then come back to another question. How has your research in this area been greeted by your peers? And this person is wondering if you could describe the evolution of your interest in this area and the reaction to it in terms of the art and race. Did you face resistance similar to the denial around Hemmings? And that was a great presentation.
Oh, that's such an interesting question. So no one's really said anything to my face. Um, arguments often happen in footnotes, so I'll have to
Hmm
look carefully at people's footnotes and see. It's interesting. I used to hedge a lot whether John Pine, for example, was of mixed race, of African descent. Um, and I would sort of hem and haw about it and say, well, it looks like it. And people would say, what's your evidence besides the visual? And
hmm
I was giving a smaller version, a part of this talk. And Jennifer Morgan, who is the noted historian of early modern history of slavery, in particular Black women's slavery, she was in the audience and she came up to me afterwards and she's like, that is a Black man. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. And she is someone who spent a great deal of time thinking about why Black people have historically been represented the way they have and what that does to prop up stereotypes of the same racism that undergirded the system of chattel slavery for hundreds of
hmm
years, right? And so with Jennifer Morgan's approval, I felt much more, I'm like, yes, I'm someone who does analysis of visual and material culture, and you're not always going to have a piece of documentary evidence to accompany the art. And I think sometimes it's important. I would say I think speculation is better than silence, because I
Mm,
think if you're not willing to speculate in cases where things are just not going to be documented in the same way, then you're silencing all these people who are not whose stories are not built into the systems of things like slavery that were meant to keep them out of the story.
Mm,
And so, I've gotten a lot more confidence, thanks to Jennifer Morgan, but also thanks to thinking about philosophically why I do this type of work, to try
mhm,
to bring these hidden stories or these forgotten stories or these unearthed stories to light. Because I think it's a way to honor the contributions of these people in the past whose stories have too often been diminished or untold.
mhm, mhm. Yes, speculation's better than silence. I love that. Okay, so let's see. I don't know if you've seen it, but we have a show on view now at PAFA of the Atwater Kent from the Atwater Kent collection. It's Philadelphia Revealed, and there's a portrait of Washington that was done by Rembrandt Peale. And this person is noticing that it's done with the head cut out and pasted in method that you were describing from Pine.
Oh,
Could
wow.
Rembrandt have copied Pine's method?
That is so fascinating. Absolutely. I mean, he was the one who described it in such detail. That is amazing. And that makes me wonder whether one of his sisters did the
Yeah,
did the filling in. I mean, I know some of his sisters were, um, popular artists in their own right, but that's really interesting. I'm gonna have to come see that. I haven't
yeah.
had a chance
Please,
to come to the
please
show
come see
yet.
it. Yep.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
Um, let's see, we're having a lot of comments on what a great presentation and interesting talk this was.
Thank you.
Does anyone have, I think we have time for one more question. Does anyone have another question? Let's see, I'm just gonna go back through the chat here and make sure that I didn't miss anything. And in the meantime, Zara, could you tell us, well, you told us the title of your book and it's gonna be out soon, which is very exciting. Let's see. Okay, I'm not seeing any additional questions, but yes, that's a great plug to come see the Philadelphia Revealed at the Fisher Brooks Gallery here at PAFA. It's on view until December. Um, and thank you so much, Zara, for spending this lunchtime hour with us. This was fascinating. You give me tons to think about, especially as we consider what's going to go up on view in the reinstallation of our permanent collection, which will open in 2026 in the Historic Landmark Building. So thank you so much. Um, I hope that you will all be back here again in a few weeks. We're going to take a couple weeks off, but we will be back on November 6th. And I will be giving a talk on the history of artist residencies. So I am looking forward to that. It's the first time I'm going to be giving this talk about some new research I've been doing. So I am very excited. Thank you to the Barron family again for your support of this program. We are incredibly grateful. And thank you all again for being here. And I will see you all again soon.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us. It was really great to have a chance to talk about this with you and center on one of my favorite paintings at PAFA.
Yes, and we can't wait to read your book.
Thank you.
All right,
Bye.
bye.